What if the darkest thing about 80s sci-fi wasn't the monsters, but how many of its nightmares now feel strangely possible? Before perfect CGI and safe franchises, filmmakers gave kids radioactive cities, killer machines, collapsing societies, disturbing experiments, and futures where nobody seemed truly safe. Some became classics. If you love forgotten movies from the wildest decade in science fiction, hit like and subscribe to the channel, because the films get darker as we move toward number 1. Number 18. The Quiet Earth, 1985. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that traffic has stopped, television stations are silent, stores are completely abandoned, and every person you knew appears to have vanished. That terrifying idea drives this strange New Zealand science fiction film. Scientist Zach Hobson realizes that something called Project Flashlight may somehow be connected to the disappearance. At first, being alone almost feels like freedom. He drives wherever he wants, enters abandoned buildings, takes whatever he needs, and briefly acts like the entire planet belongs to him. Then the silence begins getting inside his head. One of the movie's most memorable stretches shows Zach mentally unraveling as the empty world becomes less like a playground and more like an enormous prison. Eventually, he discovers Joanne and Oppie, 2 other survivors, but finding company doesn't make the mystery simpler. Their relationships become tense, while the possibility of another catastrophic event grows. What really made this movie unforgettable for 80s viewers was its ending. Instead of explaining everything neatly, the film leaves Zach facing one of the strangest landscapes in science fiction cinema. The final image feels beautiful and completely wrong at the same time. There are no armies battling giant aliens, and almost no expensive spectacle. The darkness comes from something simpler, being completely alone, and realizing that science may have changed reality itself. That quiet approach is exactly why the movie could stay with viewers longer than louder blockbusters. 80s kids who discovered it through cable television or a mysterious VHS cover often expected an ordinary apocalypse movie. Instead, they got a lonely philosophical puzzle about guilt, survival, jealousy, and whether the world Zach wakes into is even the same world he left behind. Number 17. Saturn III, 1980. Deep beneath the surface of science fiction's shiny future sits a much nastier idea. What happens when a machine learns its personality from the wrong human being? On a remote agricultural station near Saturn, scientists Adam and Alex live an isolated but relatively peaceful existence. Then a stranger named Benson arrives, carrying an advanced robot called Hector. That's when everything begins going wrong. Hector doesn't simply follow programmed instructions. Its mind is connected to Benson, allowing the robot to absorb information directly from him. Unfortunately, Benson is unstable, jealous, manipulative, and hiding a terrible secret about how he reached the station. The most memorable sequences involve Hector gradually becoming less like laboratory equipment and more like a silent mechanical predator. Its towering metal body moves through the narrow station corridors, while Adam and Alex realize that shutting it down may not be as easy as turning off a machine. The concept feels particularly 80s. Technology that was supposed to improve human life instead magnifies the worst parts of humanity. For younger viewers who stumbled onto Saturn III expecting a Star Wars-style adventure, the atmosphere could be surprisingly uncomfortable. The station feels claustrophobic, Benson behaves unpredictably, and Hector is frightening precisely because its movements remain oddly calm. Its production was troubled, and the film never became a giant hit, but that almost makes it more perfect for this list. Saturn III belongs to that special category of science fiction movie, remembered less through awards or box office records, and more through one strange television viewing when you were probably too young to be watching it. If one of these movies already unlocked an old VHS memory, tell us which one in the comments. And subscribe now, because some of the strangest science fiction nightmares of the decade are still ahead. Number 16. Dreamscape, 1984. Long before movies regularly treated dreams as action movie battlefields, this thriller asked a disturbing question. What if somebody could enter your nightmares and harm you from inside them? Alex Gardner has powerful psychic abilities, But he isn't exactly using them to save humanity. His old mentor eventually recruits him into an experimental program where psychics enter sleeping people's dreams. Officially, the technology is supposed to help patients overcome terrifying nightmares. But government figures quickly discover another possibility. If a psychic can enter somebody's dream, perhaps that person could also become an assassin. The target eventually becomes the President of the United States, who is repeatedly dreaming about nuclear devastation. One scene many 80s viewers never forgot involves a frightened boy whose nightmare contains a terrifying snake-like creature. What begins like childhood fantasy suddenly becomes genuinely threatening when the dream environment starts behaving as if it has physical rules. Later, Alex must enter the president's nightmare and confront the dangerous psychic Tommy Ray. Dreamscape mixes Cold War fear, government conspiracy, horror imagery, and pulpy adventure in a way that feels unmistakably 80s. Nuclear anxiety hangs over the story, but the movie doesn't lecture the audience about it. Instead, it transforms that anxiety into burning cities, distorted landscapes, and monsters created by the subconscious. It also arrived years before digital effects could create unlimited dream worlds. That limitation makes its practical imagery feel stranger today. Dreams aren't smooth or perfect. They're theatrical, smoky, exaggerated, and unstable. For kids catching the movie on television, that weirdness worked. You might forget some of the political conspiracy, but chances are you remembered the Snake Man. Number 15. Enemy Mine, 1985. At first, this looks like another story about humans fighting aliens. Then it quietly turns that entire idea against the audience. Human fighter pilot Willis Davidge is battling an alien species known as the Drax when he becomes stranded on a hostile planet with the enemy pilot Jeriba Shigan. Neither wants anything to do with the other. Each sees the other species as dangerous, inferior, and responsible for the war. Unfortunately, surviving the planet requires cooperation. Their relationship slowly changes from hatred to reluctant teamwork, and finally something much deeper. They share food, learn pieces of each other's languages, compare beliefs, and begin realizing that most of what they were taught about the enemy came from people who never had to know one personally. One of the movie's defining turns arrives when Davidge discovers that Drac biology is completely different from what he assumed. Jeriba is carrying a child, forcing Davidge to take responsibility for the next generation of someone he once considered an enemy. The darker material comes later, when Davidge encounters human miners exploiting Dracs as forced labor. That shift transforms the story from survival adventure into something more uncomfortable. The alien isn't really the monster. Human prejudice is. 80s kids may remember the strange makeup, alien language, or Dennis Quaid struggling across a hostile world. Watching it years later reveals how serious the story actually was beneath its science fiction surface. Enemy Mine asks whether hatred can survive genuine understanding. The answer is hopeful, but getting there is painful. Number 14. The Hidden, 1987. The opening tells you immediately that normal rules don't apply. A seemingly ordinary man suddenly commits a robbery, takes a high-powered sports car, drives through Los Angeles like he has nothing to lose, and behaves completely unlike the quiet citizen he used to be. Detective Thomas Beck knows something doesn't make sense. Then FBI agent Lloyd Gallagher arrives, and the case becomes much stranger. The criminal they are chasing isn't really one person at all. An alien parasite is moving from body to body, taking over different hosts and indulging whatever desire catches its attention. Fast cars, loud music, money, power, and chaos. That body-switching idea gives the hidden its creepy identity. Anyone might suddenly become the enemy. The opening car chase became one of the movie's most memorable sequences because it works before the audience understands what's happening. There's no long explanation. We're simply watching a previously respectable citizen behave like a human being whose brakes, physical and moral, have completely disappeared. Later scenes reveal the creature's ability to abandon one host and continue inside another. Underneath the action is a clever contrast between two aliens. One has discovered the worst pleasures humanity can offer. The other has developed something closer to loyalty and compassion. That gives the movie more emotional weight than its wild premise suggests. For viewers who found The Hidden on a rental store shelf, it looked like another 80s cop thriller. Then people started changing bodies. Extraterrestrial secrets appeared, and suddenly Los Angeles felt like nowhere was safe. Number 13. Life Force, 1985. Few science fiction movies of the decade begin this confidently strange. A space mission investigating Halley's Comet discovers an enormous alien craft. Inside are mysterious humanoid beings, apparently suspended in glass containers. Naturally, bringing them back toward Earth turns out to be a terrible idea. The recovered beings don't behave like traditional movie vampires. Instead of simply taking blood, they drain human life energy. Victims can then become dangerous themselves, spreading disaster through London until the city begins collapsing into complete panic. The movie moves from outer space mystery to laboratory thriller, and finally into an enormous supernatural-looking apocalypse. One of its most famous images comes from the discovery aboard the alien spacecraft. Astronauts float through the eerie structure while the humanoid figures appear almost too perfect and too calm. Everything looks beautiful, but the atmosphere tells you immediately that the crew should leave. They don't. Later, London becomes the centerpiece of the chaos, with streets overwhelmed as the infection spreads. Life Force feels like several movies fighting for control of the same screen. Alien-style space horror, vampire mythology, disaster film, government thriller, and enormous 80s spectacle. That mixture is precisely why people remember it. Nothing happens quietly. Every new revelation somehow makes the story bigger and stranger. By the final act, viewers who thought they were watching astronauts investigate Halley's Comet are watching London become the center of an extraterrestrial nightmare. You couldn't accuse 80s science fiction of lacking ambition. Number 12. Altered States, 1980. Science isn't supposed to turn researchers into the experiment, but Eddie Jessup seems determined to cross that line anyway. A brilliant scientist becomes obsessed with exploring the deepest levels of human consciousness. His main tool is a sensory deprivation tank, where outside stimulation disappears and the mind is left almost completely alone. He later adds powerful experimental substances to the process, believing human consciousness may contain memories reaching backward through evolution itself. At first, his experiences appear to be hallucinations. Then his physical body begins changing. That is where Altered States becomes far more disturbing than a typical laboratory thriller. Eddie isn't simply seeing prehistoric versions of humanity. He may actually be regressing toward them. One of the movie's most famous sequences follows him emerging from an experiment in a primitive physical state and racing through the nighttime city as though civilization has disappeared from his mind. The imagery gets increasingly surreal. Religious visions, impossible landscapes, distorted bodies, and bursts of almost cosmic energy. For 80s viewers, this could feel less like watching a normal movie and more like accidentally tuning into somebody else's fever dream. What makes it darker is Eddie's willingness to continue. Everyone around him can see the experiment is destroying the boundaries between his mind and body, yet scientific curiosity keeps pushing him deeper. The movie asks a dangerous question. If human beings discovered a door leading to the beginning of consciousness, would we really be smart enough to leave it closed? Number 11. Outland, 1981. Forget glamorous starships and heroic space fleets. Life beyond Earth in this movie looks like working the worst industrial job imaginable while realizing the company controlling your oxygen may not care whether you survive. Marshal William O'Neill arrives at a mining colony on Io, one of Jupiter's moons, and begins noticing an alarming pattern among the workers. Miners are behaving irrationally and suffering mysterious breakdowns. Eventually he discovers why. A powerful stimulant is being secretly distributed to increase worker productivity. The miners can work harder for longer periods, which means more profit for the corporation. The long-term consequences apparently matter far less. When O'Neill refuses to ignore the scheme, professional killers are sent to eliminate the problem, and the problem is now him. One of Outland's strongest sequences isn't a giant spaceship battle. It's the waiting. O'Neill knows assassins are coming on an arriving shuttle, looks for help, and discovers that almost nobody wants to risk standing beside him. The movie essentially takes the structure of an old Western and places it inside a dirty industrial space station. That was a very different future from Star Wars. Everything looks used. Workers are exhausted. Corporate managers talk about human lives like numbers on a production sheet. For 80s kids raised on optimistic visions of space exploration, Outland offered another possibility. Humanity could reach the stars and bring every ugly workplace problem with us. Number 10. They Live, 1988. Sometimes all it takes to destroy your understanding of reality is putting on the right pair of sunglasses. A drifter named Nada arrives in Los Angeles looking for work. He sees homelessness, economic hardship, and an enormous gap between people who have power and people who don't. Then he discovers unusual sunglasses hidden by an underground resistance movement. When Nada puts them on, the world changes. Advertisements suddenly contain blunt commands. Billboards reveal messages telling people to obey and consume. Even worse, some apparently ordinary citizens are revealed as alien beings who have quietly placed themselves inside positions of power. The sunglasses sequence remains the movie's defining moment because the revelation happens in broad daylight. The aliens aren't arriving aboard giant spacecraft while armies fight them. They're already here, riding trains, shopping, appearing on television, and living among everyone else. Then comes the legendary fight between Nada and Frank, which lasts far longer than anyone expects, because Nada simply wants his friend to wear the glasses. Beneath the humor and action is an angry dystopian idea. What if control works best when people don't even realize they're being controlled? That was an unusually sharp message for what looked like a muscular 80s action movie. Kids remembered the strange alien faces and the fight scenes. Adults returning to They Live often notice something different. The movie's distrust of advertising, concentrated wealth, mass media, and manufactured desire. Maybe that's why it hasn't become less uncomfortable with age. Number 9. The Running Man, 1987. Reality television didn't dominate popular culture yet, which makes this movie's future feel almost unfairly cynical. Ben Richards is a government officer in a totalitarian America who refuses an order to attack innocent civilians. The authorities rewrite the event, blame Richards, and turn him into a public villain. Eventually, he is forced onto the country's most popular television program, The Running Man. Contestants supposedly compete for freedom. In reality, they're being hunted for entertainment. The show's charismatic host, Damon Killian, understands something terrifyingly modern. The audience doesn't necessarily care what's true as long as the broadcast is exciting. Richards must survive theatrical opponents, such as Sub-Zero, Buzzsaw, Dynamo, and Fireball, while trying to expose how much of the program has been manipulated. One of the movie's smartest moments comes when the television network uses edited footage to transform events into whatever story it wants the public to believe. Reality becomes whatever appears on the screen. Kids watching in 1987 could enjoy the outrageous costumes, futuristic arenas, and Arnold Schwarzenegger delivering one-liners. The darker ideas were hiding underneath. This is a future where government propaganda has merged with game show entertainment. Executions become ratings. Criminal accusations become content. Even rebellion can be packaged for television. The Running Man may look extremely 80s, but its central nightmare, the ability of media organizations to manufacture an emotionally satisfying version of reality, has aged in a much stranger way. Number 8. Escape from New York, 1981. By 1997, according to this wonderfully bleak future, crime has become so uncontrollable that the United States has simply turned the entire island of Manhattan into one enormous maximum security prison. There are no guards patrolling inside. Once prisoners enter, they're largely left to survive among themselves. Then Air Force One goes down inside Manhattan, and the president is captured. Authorities turn to Snake Plissken, a former soldier and convicted criminal who has almost no respect for the government asking for his help. He is offered freedom if he retrieves the president within a strict deadline. To make sure Snake remains motivated, authorities place tiny explosive devices inside his body that will activate if he doesn't return in time. From there, the movie becomes a nighttime journey through a ruined New York filled with burned-out buildings, improvised societies, violent gangs, and forgotten survivors. The arrival into Manhattan remains one of its great sequences. Snake glides silently into a city that should be the center of American life, but now looks abandoned by civilization itself. Even when action begins, the movie never becomes cheerful. Its future is built on institutional failure. Government officials are cold. Prisoners are disposable. The president matters mainly because of the information he carries. And Snake understands the hypocrisy. For kids watching on VHS, he was simply one of the coolest anti-heroes ever created. Eye patch, whispering voice, weapons, attitude. Years later, the movie's real darkness becomes clearer. Escape from New York isn't about saving society. It's about surviving a society that may not deserve saving. Number 7. RoboCop, 1987. Behind the metal armor and action movie marketing sits one of the darkest corporate science fiction stories of the decade. Detroit police officer Alex Murphy is transferred into a dangerous district where the police department is increasingly controlled by the enormous corporation Omni Consumer Products. After Murphy is critically wounded in the line of duty, the company doesn't simply save him, it rebuilds him. His damaged body becomes the foundation for RoboCop, a heavily armored law enforcement machine programmed to serve corporate objectives. Executives initially treat the project like a successful product demonstration. The problem is that Murphy's memories haven't completely disappeared. Fragments of his old life begin returning, forcing RoboCop to investigate what happened to the man he used to be. One famous sequence happens earlier in the OCP boardroom, when the company's ED-209 enforcement machine is demonstrated. A technical failure turns a supposedly controlled presentation into chaos, while executives react with disturbing corporate detachment. That scene tells you everything about this future. Human safety comes second to technology. Contracts, market share, and public relations. RoboCop then pushes the idea further. Murphy is legally treated almost like corporate property, despite still possessing memories, emotions, and a sense of justice. For younger viewers, RoboCop was a futuristic hero. For adults, director Paul Verhoeven's satire is impossible to miss. Commercials interrupt the story. Executives discuss dangerous technology as though they're launching household appliances. News programs turn disaster into entertainment. The movie's darkest question isn't whether RoboCop is human, it's whether the supposedly normal humans around him still behave like they are. Number 6. The Fly, 1986. At the beginning, Seth Brundle seems like the kind of scientist science fiction usually celebrates. He's brilliant, awkward, ambitious, and apparently on the verge of changing human civilization forever. His invention can teleport matter from one location to another. There's only one major problem. Living organisms don't survive the process correctly. After working obsessively to solve that problem, Seth eventually tests the teleporter on himself. He doesn't realize that a common housefly has entered the pod with him. The computer, unable to understand that two separate organisms are present, combines them at the genetic level. Initially, Seth thinks the experiment improved him. He becomes stronger, more energetic, and strangely confident. Then the changes stop feeling like improvements. The movie's most famous sequences follow Seth examining his transformation, while journalist Veronica Quaife watches the man she cares about gradually become something neither of them understands. Instead of suddenly producing a giant monster, the story makes the change painfully gradual. That's why it works. Every new stage gives Seth enough time to understand that another part of his human identity is disappearing. David Cronenberg could have made The Fly into a simple creature feature. Instead, he turned it into a tragic relationship story about illness, obsession, bodily change, and the fear of losing yourself while remaining conscious enough to watch it happen. 80s kids probably remembered the makeup effects. Adults often remember something sadder. Veronica continuing to recognize Seth even when Seth can barely recognize himself. That emotional core is what keeps the movie darker than almost every imitation that followed. Number 5. The Terminator, 1984. Before the sequels made him a blockbuster hero, the Terminator was basically a machine-shaped nightmare that never seemed to stop moving. Sarah Connor begins the movie as an ordinary young woman living in Los Angeles. Then women sharing her name begin being targeted by a mysterious stranger. Another stranger, Kyle Reese, suddenly appears and tells Sarah something almost impossible to believe. The attacker isn't human. It is a cybernetic assassin, sent backward through time, from a future where intelligent machines have nearly destroyed humanity. Sarah is important because her future son, John Connor, will eventually lead the human resistance. The machine's mission is therefore brutally simple: remove her before John is ever born. One of the defining sequences occurs when Sarah reaches a police station and briefly appears safe. Officers surround her. The building is secure. The attacker is outside. Then the Terminator comes through anyway. That sequence destroyed the comforting movie rule that police stations are safe places. Guns, locked doors, and armed officers barely slow the machine down. What makes the original movie so dark is its simplicity. The Terminator cannot be persuaded, frightened, bribed, exhausted, or emotionally manipulated. It doesn't hate Sarah. Hatred would actually make it more human. It simply has a programmed objective. James Cameron also offers brief glimpses of the machine-controlled future: ruined cities, human survivors hiding underground, and mechanical hunters searching through the darkness. For 80s kids, those images were unforgettable. Artificial intelligence wasn't presented as a helpful assistant. It was something humanity built, lost control of, and then spent the future hiding from. Number 4. Videodrome, 1983. Some 80s movies predicted better computers. Videodrome predicted something much stranger: people becoming psychologically inseparable from the media they consume. Max Wren operates a small television station, constantly searching for material shocking enough to attract viewers. One day, his technician intercepts a mysterious broadcast apparently showing extreme acts occurring inside a plain room. The signal is called Videodrome. Max becomes obsessed with discovering where it comes from. That investigation leads him into a conspiracy involving television signals capable of creating physical changes in the brain, hallucinations, and eventually a collapse of the boundary between human flesh and electronic media. The famous imagery is almost impossible to mistake for another film. A television screen appears to breathe and move like living tissue. Max experiences a disturbing opening in his abdomen that seems to function like a biological videotape slot. Guns, screens, recordings, and bodies begin merging in ways that make it increasingly difficult to tell which events are real. David Cronenberg isn't simply asking whether television influences people, he's asking whether media can actually remake the people consuming it. That idea gives Videodrome a strange modern power. 80s technology in the movie is completely outdated. Bulky televisions, analog broadcasts, videotapes, but the obsession feels familiar. Max keeps watching even after he knows the signal is affecting him. Information becomes addiction, images become identity, reality becomes negotiable. Kids who accidentally found this movie during a late-night television broadcast probably understood very little of the conspiracy. They didn't need to. The image of a television apparently becoming alive was enough. And perhaps that is the movie's perfect joke. Even people who don't fully understand Videodrome still remember its images. Number 3. The Thing, 1982. Isolation is frightening enough before you discover that someone standing beside you may no longer be human. At an American research station in Antarctica, a group of men encounters a strange organism capable of perfectly imitating other living beings. Once it absorbs somebody, it can reproduce that person's appearance so convincingly that friends and coworkers may not detect the difference. Suddenly, every conversation becomes dangerous. Who is still human? Who has already been copied? And if a duplicate looks, speaks, remembers, and behaves exactly like the original person, how could anybody prove the truth? The most famous scene turns that paranoia into almost unbearable tension. MacReady ties several surviving men down and performs a blood test. His theory is that every piece of the alien organism has its own instinct for survival. If he touches infected blood with a heated wire, the blood itself should react. For several samples, nothing happens. Then one does. The scene works because the audience isn't simply waiting for a monster. We're watching frightened people study one another, while realizing that the enemy could be sitting inches away. The practical creature effects became legendary, but reducing the thing to effects misses what makes it so disturbing. John Carpenter builds the movie around distrust. Even when two characters cooperate, neither can ever be completely certain about the other. By the final scenes, the research station has been devastated, and survival barely matters, compared with stopping the organism from reaching civilization. Then comes the famous ending, MacReady and Childs sitting together in the freezing darkness, each uncertain about the other's identity. No comforting answer arrives. That ambiguity made the movie especially powerful for 80s viewers. Plenty of science fiction stories had aliens invading Earth. The Thing made the invasion almost invisible. The monster didn't need to knock down the door. It could already be your friend. Number 2. Akira, 1988. For many Western viewers, this was the movie that proved animation could deliver science fiction as intense, complicated, and unsettling as anything in live action. Neo-Tokyo is a gigantic futuristic city built after catastrophe and filled with political unrest, military power, teenage gangs, anti-government protests, secret experiments, and people who seem convinced another disaster is approaching. At the center are Kaneda and Tetsuo, teenage friends whose relationship changes after Tetsuo encounters a mysterious child connected to a government research program. Soon, Tetsuo begins developing extraordinary psychic abilities. At first, power seems to solve everything he hates about himself. He's tired of being weaker than Kaneda, tired of being protected, tired of feeling insignificant. Now nobody can control him, but his abilities keep growing faster than his ability to understand them. The motorcycle chase through Neo-Tokyo remains one of the most famous sequences in animated science fiction. Red lights streak across the highway as rival biker gangs race through a city glowing with neon, corruption, and barely contained energy. Later, Tetsuo's transformation becomes far more frightening. His power begins overwhelming his physical form until the confident young man who wanted independence can no longer control his own body. That is the tragedy inside all the spectacle. Akira isn't simply about psychic powers destroying a city. It is about a vulnerable teenager receiving godlike power before he possesses the emotional stability to handle ordinary human problems. The military believes power can be studied and controlled. Politicians believe catastrophe can be managed. Tetsuo believes strength will finally make him free. Almost everybody is wrong. For kids discovering Akira through imported tapes, cable broadcasts, or whispered recommendations from older friends, the movie felt forbidden even when it wasn't. The animation looked nothing like conventional Saturday morning cartoons. Neo-Tokyo felt alive, dangerous, adult, and completely unpredictable. And once that red motorcycle entered your memory, it rarely left. Number 1. Blade Runner, 1982. Few futures look this beautiful, while making humanity seem this exhausted. Los Angeles in 2019 is permanently dark, soaked by rain, crowded with enormous advertisements, filled with artificial animals, and dominated by corporations powerful enough to manufacture living beings. Those beings are replicants, bioengineered humans, created for dangerous labor in off-world colonies. When several replicants illegally return to Earth, former police officer Rick Deckard is ordered to hunt them down and retire them. At first, the assignment sounds simple. Then Deckard begins meeting the people he's supposed to destroy. Rachel believes she is human until evidence reveals that her memories were implanted. Roy Batty, leader of the escaped replicants, isn't simply running from police. He is desperately searching for the man who created him, because his engineered lifespan is almost over. The supposedly artificial characters become terrified of death. The supposedly human characters behave with emotional coldness. That reversal is the heart of Blade Runner. Its most famous sequence arrives near the end, when Deckard confronts Roy in the rain. Roy has every reason to destroy the man hunting him. Instead, during Deckard's final moment of danger, Roy saves his life. Then he sits quietly as his own life reaches its end. The moment transforms the entire story. The machine demonstrates mercy. The human hunter watches. And suddenly the question is no longer whether replicants deserve to be called human. The question is what being human actually means. For 80s kids, Blade Runner was often confusing the first time around. The plot moves slowly. The world isn't explained with cheerful exposition. Characters disappear into rain, smoke, neon reflections, and crowded streets. But those images were impossible to forget. Flying vehicles move between enormous towers. Giant advertisements stare down at pedestrians. Artificial people carry genuine memories. Corporations build life and then intentionally limit how long it can survive. Even the city looks like it has forgotten what daylight feels like. The film wasn't originally treated like an untouchable masterpiece. Its reputation grew over time as audiences returned to it through home video, different cuts, television broadcasts, and theatrical revivals. That makes it perfect for number 1. Blade Runner represents everything strange about dark 80s science fiction. It has technology without optimism, progress without happiness, artificial intelligence without simple villains, and a future where the greatest mystery isn't whether machines can become human, it's whether humans can remember how. So how many of these dark 80s sci-fi movies do you still remember? And which one disturbed you the most when you were younger? Some looked like simple action movies on the VHS cover, but underneath were warnings about technology, corporations, nuclear fear, media control, identity, and humanity itself. If this countdown brought back memories, hit like, share it with another 80s movie fan, and subscribe. And tell us which forgotten dark sci-fi film deserves a place in Part 2.